We were on a family vacation driving to Anaheim, California, to my cousin's house in Houston, Texas. We had gone through Cabazon and seen the dinosaur statues and were planning to stop at a lot of those kind of tourist attractions. Isn't that the whole point of driving instead of flying? Out of Cabazon, we took the 10 South past the Salton Sea down to Yuma and spent the night. It was hot as hell. We then drove on the 10 South out of Phoenix to Tucson to spend the night there and see some observatory sightseeing stuff. Then on to Houston. We got a late start on our third day, and as we took the 10 South through the Sonoran Desert and just outside of a place called Benson, we passed a desert hillside covered with cacti. And there, moving up towards the top of the hill, were these enormous horns. "Well, look at that," my dad said. "You just never know what you might see on the road. I think that's a big horn." I looked up from my Marvel comic book and saw the thing up there in the sunset. And just as we passed it, my dad tells me, "Can you see it behind the hill?" I moved my head around and saw a huge horned animal, a giant red-black monster with wings. I started screaming. My mom and sister seemed annoyed, but my dad looked back, then pulled the car off the road. He could not see the hill, and it was too far back to walk by the time he pulled over. My mom and sister thought I was just trying to get attention. And the next turnoff was already too far away. It was getting late, and my dad had a schedule to keep, so we did not go back. As I got older, I never gave up the story. I know what I saw, even if it was for just a couple of seconds. My dad came to believe what I saw in time. And this encounter for me happened roughly, I want to say, I think sometime in the summer of 1987. It was either July or August. I was a caver in the early 70s, and I was caving in the Whetstone Mountains and back in the day, at the time of Gary, Tennant, and Randy Tufts discovered the Kartchner Caves in 1974. Excuse me on pronunciation of that. Well, we found caves of our own, and just like those guys, we kept our secret. I think those guys found almost 3 miles of caves and kept it a secret from the general public until '87. I know those guys said after the fact that the main reason they kept it a secret was to protect the pipes from vandalism. I wondered because after we stumbled upon a hollow rope of our own at around the same time, we came to the immediate conclusion that some things can and should be kept a secret for a lot longer. With us, we love to trap crevices, sinkholes, or short caves, which hid much bigger caves. Most people do not realize that the Sonoran Desert hides hundreds of miles of known caves, but a lot of them are just unreachable by humans, and I believe the reality is more like thousands of miles. Is that so hard to believe? That there are thousands of miles of caverns traversing the subterranean world beneath the most biologically diverse desert in the world? We had a sonar guy come out and radar the flat pan. He scoped deep and started railing. He was all flushed and excited, claiming a vein and veins of tunnels underneath us. I remember one time I was talking with Aaron Campbell, who was a state biologist, back when bell-bottoms were a thing. I told him, if a rat can live his whole life without taking a single drink of water, what else don't we know about? He answered me, "Yeah, but that is because those kangaroo rats evolved so that it gets moisture from leaves and things like that." And then he went on about their nasal passages being able to cool its breath through condensation and convert moisture into water. It manages to extract moisture from the air. It's an evolution. Exactly, I told him. He asked me, "What did you find?" He stared at me. "Was there something more than the fossils?" He stared some more. I said nothing. He was referring to the prehistoric fossils I showed him. They contained trilobites, pupfish, apparent small lizard tracks, maybe a toad, turtle, snake, but we saved the best for ourselves. This is what we found. Deep in this labyrinth of caves never seen by any human, we found a fossil of something initially we thought was a pterodactyl, but as we separated the Creosit buildup, we discovered the wings to be attached to a biped with a massive torso and long, thick legs. The first thing I realized was Nobody lays such an elaborate hoax miles down in an unknown or otherwise unknown desert cave to maybe be found by cavers sometime in the next 1,000 years. And, truth be told, we did not want anyone else to know about it. This thing was too unbelievable. Best I could ascertain from the thing next to a stream, the layering was just from the Mesozoic area between Jurassic and Cretaceous, but the life form appeared to be far too advanced, to my way of thinking, to be organically lodged there. But then I did not know what it was, so it's anybody's guess. I knew if we reported this, it would either be ridiculed and falsely debunked, or we would be killed for what we knew. Now, I know it sounds like a conspiracy theory wildness to say we would be killed, but I saw that thing. It shook the conventions of everything science knows, and you have to be aware of where that road may take you. I remember Carl and Eric and myself sat there for more than an hour after jimmying the limestone away, our flashlights shining up the pot. It appeared to be a perfectly preserved skeletal fossil of a flying horned man, approximately 8 feet tall, roughly. The more we inspected it, the more adrenaline my body had to accommodate. I was scared. Horns like a ram, a 10-foot-plus wingspan, horribly vicious teeth with claws on hands and feet, both of which had 5 fingers and toes, 2 arms, 2 legs, torso. I never saw this dinosaur in our grade school books. We agreed to keep our secret, and I knew I could trust Carl and Eric. They were honest guys, but maybe some importantly, they were desert quasi-hermits like me. We lived in modest desert homes, and we came from out here for a reason, to be away from the assholes of the world. It was 3 days before we talked to each other again, and when we did speak, I could see these guys had the same thing on their mind. Did we really see that? That weekend, we made a plan to go back down there, and after all the turns and twists, squeezing and pushing and like that, we ended up at the same place, facing the same impossible thing, that pristine fossil, miles along unknown caves in the Sonoran underground. It was just as we had left it, just as it had been left for us for millions of years. It was a revelation. We took pictures and agreed to stay silent for the time. It was 3 days later when I decided I would venture down to the cave on a Saturday night. It was driving me crazy, and I needed to go back down there. But at the last minute, I felt it would be wrong to go without Carl and Eric. I called them. They were just as bothered as me, and we all met at the entry spot outside Tombstone. We went in around 10 p.m. on a Saturday night. We got around. Maybe half of the way to the place when we heard someone else in the cave. Now, understand it would have been bad enough to hear anyone out in the middle of the desert on a Saturday night. But when you are ass deep in an unknown cave, well then you know there is trouble. We tried to play it cool, but it was not the easiest thing to do. We heard something walking a ways down in the cave beneath us. 2 feet walking sounds different than 4. Heavy sounds different than light. Then I could hear something behind us, coming from one of the tributary tunnels. We whispered to each other about what to do and how to do it. But then the hair on the back of our necks stood up when we heard a long, purring sound directly behind us, from the only exit/entrance we knew. I almost did not want to look. I turned my flashlight and saw nothing, but we all knew something had just been there. We decided it was time to get out, and we would come back in the morning. We got about a quarter of the way back when we heard the loud, purring, clicking sound again, and this time from behind us, where the fossil was. So we turned our flashlights and the lights fell on this thing. It looked like a huge Gila monster. The eyes and skin appeared reptilian. And then it lifted its head up and I noticed 2 things. Sheep horns and a prominent cleft chin. A cleft chin? Seriously? This thing looked like the goddamn devil incarnate. And down in a cave in the desert, no less. I suddenly felt like we had been tricked into descending into hell. It felt like hell. It was hot, dark, scary, and now we are trapped in here with this thing. But some reflex took over in me. Something in the other half of my brain, which tried to convince me I was just seeing an animal, an organic thing that would die and decompose. A desert creature, even with the gothic face. My logical brain told me not to get bit, or at least attacked. But when the thing stood up from its spot in the hole, all my rationalization was gone. It stood up in the dark, and you could see the wings folded behind it. It began sizing us up, standing there in a dark, massive, red man's body. And those gleaming yellow eyes. It took my breath away. I really could not breathe. Then the thing leaned forward and poked its head toward us, and then squinted. It dropped its mouth open, and you could hear it breathing. I could even feel its hot, dead breath boiling over us. Then it disappeared back in the hole below. We scrambled. We got about 20 feet up, and there was a collapse behind us. The rocks fell, and the dust billowed in the shaft all around us. By the time we got out, we were amazed we did not get killed in the avalanche. It is terrifying to be in a cave during a crush, and unthinkable when there is something in there chasing you around. We stood there around the cars, catching our breath. I noticed the dust cloud pouring out of the cave at night, a smoking slit. It was like there was an explosion from the opening. What was that? What was that? Carl rambled. That was a full-on collapse. We were lucky we got out. There was a great deal of talk. We went home, and I could not sleep. The next day, the three of us did go back. We would go down only about 40 feet. The shaft was hopelessly slabbed off. It was crushed solid. I suppose we could have requested an excavation or some other nonsense, which would have never happened. As the days passed, we all agreed that the animal we saw down in the cave was exactly the same creature as the fossil we saw. It was just living further down in those caves. And really, it is not that difficult to believe, considering crocodiles and sharks never evolved since the dinosaur days. The only difference is that they are just not as shocking because they live in plain sight. We're used to them by now. I had a friend, Chris McCauley. He was from Toronto and staying with a family down in San Diego for about a month. He had never seen the American desert and desperately wanted to while he was in the States. So we made a plan. I drove down from Los Angeles to fetch him. We took the 8 East out of California and then jumped on the US 95 North, just across the border in Arizona near Yuma, and ended up driving the Expanse just around sunset. He was blown away. He could not believe the view looking west. The desert comes right up to the edge of the road, so you feel like you are in it all right. And the US 95 North is cracked and patched up, a 2-lane highway running along the solitary telephone lines and meager poles on east side of the road, but when you look west, it is as though man was never there. This is just like the cowboy movies, eh? He told me. Yeah, Clint Eastwood probably shot here, I joked. And then about 30 minutes outside of a place called Quartzsite, the sun disappeared completely, and we were in the dark save our headlights, which stretched out on an empty road going north through the desert to Needles. I asked him if he wanted to stop by Lake Havasu when he saw something falling on the road in front of us. I slowed to a stop. Are those fish? He asked me. And surely enough, they were. We both got out of the car to see fish. Live fish, or at least some sort of poor things appeared to be still moving. In particular, there was a big fish that lay gasping on the pavement. Where did they come from? Chris laughed. They dropped out of the sky. He scoffed and looked up into the dark, starry night. I think they were probably dropped by a bird from overhead. Probably scored them in a nearby lake. It happens, I told him. Not that I knew what I was talking about at all, but it seemed like the logical explanation. The other 2 fish that had been dropped on the road were more just fish heads with entrails. How they still had been moving, I don't really understand. But the big fish was still intact. He was still alive, and I thought I could save it by tossing it in some water if I can find some. You know, a drainage ditch, a pond, a puddle, something. Maybe there is a water hole around here we can throw this fish in, I told Chris. Chris looked down at the fish in the headlights and told me, he's gone, man. The fish was not gasping anymore. Dead. Chris looked up at me and said, unless you know fish CPR. He laughed and then made some sarcastic remark about mouth to mouth. We got back in the car and continued the drive. It's funny, though, that big fish was still alive. You would think if it dropped from way up there, it would have been smashed too, he wondered. Well, maybe the bird dropped it from just above the headlights, I told him. Yeah, I guess. I remember, he nodded. Weird, though, he finished. Maybe there was a truck way up ahead and they fell off and bounced up in the air. Well, it's the desert. A lot of weird things out here, I told him. Then dumbass Chris started singing Hotel California. I knew it was only a matter of time before you started that shit. I shook my head. I turned on the radio and started punching buttons. I'd rather listen to AM weather reports than hear you sing, I lathered out. He continued, unfazed. Boom! Something smashed on the road in front of the car. I slammed on the brakes and the car slid and we came just inches short of smashing into the thing on the road. We sat there for a moment, catching our breath. We could see it was the large carcass of some animal, maybe a cow, and it had just been dropped out of the sky on the highway. We were not laughing anymore. Shit just got real. Neither one of us wanted to get out of the car. I tried to pull around the thing, which was plopped in the middle of the road. My God, is that a cow? Chris gasped. Yeah, I think so. I don't know how, I told him. That's not a fucking bird that dropped that, Chris shot out. I don't know if I can pull around it. I am scared we might get stuck in the sand, I asked Chris. Should we get it out and move it? We'll move it and get it out of here, eh? Chris asked me nervously. Maybe we can get back up, turn around, find a different route, and this is just wrong. So I told Chris okay and began backing up. Suddenly a sandstorm came out of nowhere. It was thick and heavy, and the car started rocking. The wind was so brutal, and you could hear the sand spackling my ride. I said. Chris kept asking me, what is this? What's going on? What? He was panicked. It's okay, dude. It's just a sandstorm. It will pass. We'll just ride it out, I told him. How long do these last? He usually asked me. Usually not very long. They usually only thin out within minutes, enough for us to skate in. And surely enough, after a few more hard gusts, the sand thinned and the wind had died. And that was when our headlines, cut through the haze of the dust, fell on the empty road in front of us. The cow was gone. Where is it? He panicked. Where is it? He looked around the road, the shoulder, the immediate surrounding desert. The wind didn't blow that away, he kept shouting. Somebody's out there. I just started driving. We were going along and Chris was really losing it. He kept asking me, what's going on? Is this normal? And I kept answering, I don't know. We drove for about 10 more minutes. Chris told me that this road is scary. This highway scares the hell out of him. Yeah, that's some bad voodoo, I agree, I answered. Where's a turnoff? There is no turnoff, he started spitting out. I told him we would stop at a service station in the next town and decide what we should do. He no longer wanted to go to the Needles. And then he asked me, so how far is Grand Canyon? Can we just go straight there? I told him to get the map, and BAM! Something smashed into the top of the car, denting the roof, and sounded like it rolled off. I saw a shadow flash by the window and drop on the road behind us. Chris was screaming and swearing. I kept the car moving forward because I was scared to stop. Then, thud! A heavy blob dropped on the road in front of us. I stopped. The car idled as we both stared. What looked like the same cow was dropped on the road in front of us. Chris screamed. I put the car in reverse and started backing out. And then Chris shouted, Look, look, look! He pointed out the front window. My headlights had just skewed just off the cow and the road, but we could see something. Giant bat wings flopping down to the cow. Is that a bat? Look how big that is, he shouted. Yeah, they have big bats here, I told him. We watched it for a moment, and the wings descended over the carcass and appeared to grab it and start flapping, but still difficult to make out so much in the shadows. I could see basic shapes in the dark, one lump pulling the other lump off the road and into the desert. and then we could see the shadow lift up the cow and drop it, maybe 10 or 20 feet from the road. "Shine the lights on it." I thought it was a safe enough thing to do because I did not have a flashlight in the car and was already angling the car backward. So I continued backing up and wheeled the lights around. The lights fall on the cow and bat over there in the dark. "Holy crap," Chris said. My mouth just dropped open. This thing with humongous bat wings had squatted over the cow and was eating its guts. I mean, just pulling handfuls of its guts out and wolfing them down. But it was not a bat. It was the devil. It had a man's face and wild horns. When the lights hit the thing, it did not even seem to react. It just sat eating bloody handfuls of cow guts, and then started ripping at its own skin, tearing with a face full of violent teeth. "Oh my God," I remember was all I could say. I slammed the car into drive and we flew forward. I think it was about 10 minutes later that we made it to a service station in Quartzsite, Arizona. There was a guy working the counter where we went to get gas who treated us like we were raving idiots. We were screaming and tossing, and he just sort of wrinkled his brow and then asked us how much gas we needed. I rolled back outside and started filling up the tank. Chris hung back staring up at the sky like a child who just saw his first star, and then some old guy pulled up across from us and started gassing up. "You can still drive like that?" he asked me. He was referring to the crushed roof. "Yeah," I told him. "I just hunch," I started. "We had some trouble. I've seen blood on a smashed bumper before when I hit a deer, but I never saw blood on a smashed roof before," he laughed. "Looks like you underestimated the weight. How the hell did you get it on there?" he asked. At first, I did not understand what he was talking about. Then Chris walked up behind me and the man said, "What do you guys do with it? Did you get it home?" "What do you mean?" I asked him. "Were you able to get it home and have to leave it?" he asked. "Yeah, we were able to get it home," I told him. "That's good you were able to get it home, but too bad about your roof," he finished, loading his patrol and walked over to our car, inspecting it. "See, the problem is you shouldn't be strapping a deer to the top of your car. You need a truck if you're going to haul it." He told us and walked back to his ride. "You lost a lot of venison." "Lesson learned," I told him. After the guy pulled away, Chris turned to me. He thought that was from a deer we put on the car. I guess, I don't know, I just wanted him to go. We ended up staying at a motel in Quartzsite that night. We drove back to San Diego in the morning, under the safety of sunlight, and we both agreed we did not want to be on the desert road anymore at night. I don't know what that thing was, but I am glad it decided not to kill us, because I don't know what we would have done if that thing had attacked the car that night after we drove away. Maybe it was too full of cow to be interested in us at the time. Chris, on the other hand, was sure it was Satan himself. He took it as a sign and totally changed his life. I lived in a spot in Arizona where we always had people from Mexico crossing into the U.S., and some of those people were not nice. Sometimes they were seriously strapped. It was on a late Friday night when the automatic light went on and some of the ranch guys and me rode out to the line. Sometimes these people just needed water and we would feel bad for them. Other times they would run away or shoot at you. Always a crapshoot. So it's always best to ride out there a little nervous and always prepared for anything. My neighbor, Richard, and I met at the southern west line pole when we saw someone running from the scrub brush. It was just a couple guys. They took off. We beamed them, but for the first time ever, runners did not stop in the light for even a reaction, which was strange. So Richard started yelling at them in Spanish. Still, these guys were hustling. Well, he went to cut them off, and while I stay at the perimeter to ensure that these guys were not just creating a diversion for a larger group to sneak past. But I noticed even after Dick had them at gunpoint, these guys aren't acting the usual. They were begging him for help and pointing rather than running in fear. The first thing I think is coyotes or cartel were chasing these guys. Just then, Paul Anderson ripped up in his new Ford F-150. He has his two guys and one of our other neighbors in the back. "Coyotes?" he asked me. "Well, they're running from something more than us." We were talking, but also nervous. You get anxious at times like that because you're trying to figure out what is going on in rough terrain and might be outgunned and always hated. None of us wanted to get stuck in a jackpot, but we always knew things could turn quick. You never know what was going to jump out at you in a situation like that. Well, I can sure say that we never thought it would be what came next. Gunshots. Automatic gunfire on that side of the border. That never happens. Everybody stuck, guns up, like peckers in a whorehouse. Then we went dark, completely silent. We heard screaming, several people screaming. That awful panic scream you hear when people are fighting for their life. I heard that before in the service. Safe to say, we all thought the same thing. Somebody didn't pay or open their mouth, probably cartel, maybe a coyote. I motioned to listen, and we all did. Then things got Spielberg. We heard shots again, this time coming at us from the northwest. It was intermittent, and again we heard a scream. Then, up in the sky in the same direction, we heard a pathetic shriek and a rapid fire. And because it was night over there, we could clearly see the discharge of a weapon up in the air. And because it was a full moon, we could also see something else. We scrambled. George swiveled the spot and Tom got on the radio to call it in. Then we all blew a gasket. We looked up at the spot George was shining. I expected to see an ultralight. You know, the light one-seater plane with a super muffler for damping drugs or the like. But boy, oh boy, it was sure not a plane. It was a fucking dragon. I'm telling you, as sure as I'm sitting here, we all saw it, all 7 of us. All saw the same thing, the same fucking thing. I called it a dragon because it had wings, a tail, and horns, and it was flapping and flying away, carrying a person. So what the hell else do you call that? Richard peeled out after it, and one of the George's kids, Teddy, followed him. They were shooting, emptying their cartridges in the sky at the damn thing, but it was flying too fast and too high. About a half hour later, Richard came back with an Uzi he found on the desert floor. We thought it must have been from the guy who was carried away. We turned the weapon over to the Border Patrol. Of course, when we considered what we saw, the feds just told us, "You must have seen a bat. They have giant bats out here, millions of them." Well, I know this much, that weren't no fucking bat. At first, we lost the 2 guys that had initially got our attention, but we caught up to them a few hours later, heading north in the open brush. Teddy got the story from them in Spanish. He said the guys told him that something in the sky started following them while they were crossing the desert. A couple miles before they reached the border, one of the guys they were with got snatched up. There was panic, and then the guy was dropped back down. He was alive but terrified. They started running, and then again were being attacked from the dark. That is when they crossed the fencing and were running in fear from it. They told Teddy, "It was a bat, bigger than a man, with arms and legs." Yep, it sure was. I don't know what the hell that thing was. There could be a lot of things around us we don't really know about. But if you live on the desert, you already know that.